Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Paradigm Shift. I'm Jonathan Lawrence, Director of Product Marketing for Tradeshift, and your host for this event. If you missed our previous session, just a quick reminder that this is a three-part series about the economics of supply chain resilience and whether or not in a post-COVID world, we are as adaptive as we need to be. The title of today's conversation is, What Does It Take to Build More Agile Supply Chains? If the last 18 months has taught us anything, gang, it's made it clear that an increased connectivity between buyers and suppliers would have significantly helped enterprises sail more smoothly through the pandemic than they did. Now, as outbreaks forced closures that disrupted supply chains worldwide, the ability to pivot quickly, to access much needed cash flow, and collaborate in real time became critical. Now, I believe we all recognize that building end-to-end resilience across supply chains will require a far more dynamic level of connectivity across supply chains than has ever been apparent up till now. So here to break down the complex topic of what does it take to build more agile supply chains are three distinguished guests. From Tradeshift, we have John Carls, Senior Vice President of Product, and Subrata Govil, Senior Director of Product Strategy. Moderating today's session is industry expert Jason Bush, founder of Agile Partners and Spend Matters. So without further ado, I'm going to turn everything over to John, Subrata, and Jason. Welcome, everyone.
It's great to be here today. And I think we're dealing with a very topical situation right now. For everybody in the finance or procurement world, we are truly living in, shall we say, interesting times. If you're in the States and you have orders on the water coming from Asia or somewhere else, the backups at ports are unprecedented. The cost of container shipping from China up 10 or 15x year over year. That is, if you can even get a container. Supply availability across the board, from metals to resin, to any type of finished part is even in question at any price right now in different industries. So we live in very interesting times as trading partners. So the fragility of supply chains have dramatically been exposed in kind of the emergence from the COVID pandemic era. And as finance and procurement professionals and as suppliers, we need to make sense of this all. So as we think about supply chains historically as being tuned or being lean, we need to almost expand our definitions and get more creative. And if we look as well in terms of visibility of supply chains today, I know of one study referencing work Deloitte did that found that 65% of organizations have limited or no visibility past that initial tier or tier one of the supply chain, which further challenges the situation in terms of supply availability, as well as suppliers' ability to serve their customers. So my initial question for the panel here is, in what ways are organizations kind of changing their efforts from a digital perspective? And digitization, obviously has become much more than a buzzword recently. Digital transformation has been key. But when it comes to buyers and suppliers, procurement, finance, and supply chain organizations, what changes are organizations making from a digital perspective? And as we emerge from the pandemic, how is this impacting processes and operations?
Jason, thank you. And I can go first. First of all, I think digitization has accelerated as a priority dramatically within companies. Whereas it was always important, now it's a must-have, and particularly for global companies. What they realized is that the standard manual processes really broke down when people physically couldn't be at work. They couldn't access the factories, they couldn't access the offices. So you saw procurement slowing down because companies couldn't physically manufacture or ship the goods. You saw AP slowing down because many systems demanded that people be in offices to manage exceptions. So they realized that their normal communication flow, which relied mostly on emails, physical paper, phone calls, it just simply stopped working. And buyers and sellers literally could not reach each other. And their systems were built to support a physical presence, or at least they, at some point in the chain, demanded that someone physically be accessing a system within the office. So for many companies, I think the pandemic demonstrated that global strategy requires digitization. It's not a nice to have or a should have, but it's a must have to maintain the efficiency they had pre-pandemic. And that digitization brings that efficiency through online collaboration and more transparency of the transaction end to end.
Super helpful. And if I were to kind of expand on that and ask Subrata a follow-up question, why are analog models, historically paper, right, or even email? Why are these models such a challenge when it comes to getting insight into what is happening today? And we could even expand that into legacy technology applications, right? ERP business applications. Why don't these work in today's supply chain?
Yeah, so I'd like to share an example. Like if we imagine the laptop about 20 years ago, how it got to us versus now. It was earlier all manufactured under one roof. But today, if you think of it, every single part or pieces are being manufactured and assembled in different tiers of the supply chain. So just imagining how global the supply chain has become. And if we imagine the collaboration and the communication to keep the end customer up to date on that, that is just not possible with a paper-based approach any longer. And I'll share a very personal example that happened recently. I ordered a garage door, and the first manufacturer that I went to, they could not update me that my order was delayed coming in. And then I switched and went to Costco, and their order was delayed as well, but they were able to inform me. So, you know how paper-based versus technology, having that full transparency into the end-to-end, like starting from your planning to manufacturing and to the end customer, that visibility and transparency is just not possible with a paper-based approach.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I'll just kind of rev on that for 1 second. Even in kind of, more traditional offline industries, it can be incredibly challenging. I was just reading a piece in the journal this morning about how construction companies are having to substitute products. It was, a few months ago and kind of during the pandemic, they would have 1 or 2 items, to complete a project, a build out of some sort, commercial or residential. But now they're missing half a dozen or more key items. They simply can't get them. So product substitution. And if you need to do that on a manual basis, you're doing it after the fact. So the greater visibility you have. Again, crazy times. So in terms of where we are today and embedding connectivity and transparency into supply chains, at least on an ideal basis, if we expand on some of the things you both said, a lot of process improvement and digitization just starts with access to data for buyers and suppliers. So I'm curious, maybe I'll give this one to John. Where is the best place to start in terms of collecting data? And then where do you go next? And then how does data really fuel the life cycle of supply chain engagement between buyers and suppliers in this environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And first, data collection, there's some standard information that every company wants from their supply chain. But they're also going to have differences. And I think it's less important to focus on specific data fields that you want to capture. It's more important to establish trust in a digital first relationship and also demonstrate the value of that digital relationship. We're talking about how do you transform from a manual physical process to a digital one, a paper-based process to a digital one. And the reason those efforts often fail is because the old way was simply as efficient as it could get for the supply chain. It was low effort. It didn't require much from them. And when companies typically launch a digitization program, they use it as an opportunity to push a lot of the problems back on their supply chain. So they start asking for a ton of information, often which the sellers can't actually provide. They don't know the information, or at least the contact the buyer has can't answer those questions. So what we see when a transformation project is occurring, when we see success, it's because the buyer has invested in delivering value to their supply chain first and asking for information second. So, what is that value? You don't put a bunch of questions in front of the seller. You put the information you have in front of the seller that they already need to know. So that could be the new orders that you want me to fulfill, put that together with the invoices that you filed with me, the processing of those invoices and the payment of those invoices. That's information that those sellers must have access to run their business. And often the way they get that information is by sending emails or picking up the phone. So if buyers can expose the information they already have in their organization and give the sellers value, then that seller is more likely to go to that place, whether it's a portal or some system that you've rolled out. That's going to give them a reason to go back there, where you can then introduce new business processes and start asking for the information that's critical. So when you start asking for that information, again, you want to expose what you already have in your systems. And we all know that vendor master data management is a challenge for most companies, and it's usually outdated or incomplete. Well, instead of asking for all this information that you might already have, why don't you just expose that information to the seller and ask them to verify that information up front? Again, that's an easy way to get the right information when you need it, and also giving that seller trust that you already know something about them. Why they don't have to re-enter this information 10 times. And again, it's about adding value in that digital link and getting them to trust that digital link, so they know when they need information or when you need information, they can go to one place and really get it.
That makes sense. So Subrata, I guess my follow-up question on that is, how important is that foundational layer of connectivity, within a technology environment, application, platform, marketplace? And I guess the kind of corollary to that question is can you skip it or not? Is that foundational layer key?
Yes. So I would say that foundational layer is very key, in the sense that we want to build on top of that to enable more a trustworthy platform. And like John said, that one of the goal of a digitized platform is to have the buyer and seller relationship trust enabled in that, and then building upon that base information throughout our transactional data is where you can enhance and better inform both the suppliers and buyers across the entire supply chain funnel, in terms of the availability of the goods, or if there's a delay, or if payments is being delayed from both the ends. So I think that base layer is the foundational block, and then is like how you build on top of that. What other functionalities provide value to your buyers and sellers? So that's how I would think of our platform providing value.
So my follow-up question for John there is, in a marketplace environment or any technology environment, one of the huge challenges of any type of technology where there needs to be dual engagement, buyer and supplier, and obviously reflected within both organizations as well, not just a single point of interface, but others, is creating value for all parties. I remember when I first got into the space, it was a very long time ago, almost 25 years ago, and I went to a conference put on by an organization called Net Market Makers, and they talked about what they called the fat butterfly of marketplaces. This is when they were more vision and then reality. But the key was, how do you create value on both sides of the equation, and then how do you quantify it? So I'm curious, John, for your views on that, and then what types of capabilities should you build into solutions to make sure the value is there for both parties?
Yeah, so I think Marketplace is a great example where you can provide a great deal of value for both the buyers and the sellers. For buyers, the value comes from extending your procurement options that are available to your employees and reducing the cost of managing more sellers in your procurement platform. And at the same time, still keeping those business controls that are critical. Like, there's a lot of reluctance, I think, for people to go on a traditional B2C marketplace where their employees can buy anything they want. That's not compliant with your procurement policies. So it's also about maintaining that control, but expanding the assortment. I think you can quantify the value for the buyer by looking at the cost savings of adding new vendors. There is a cost that most companies track pretty carefully associated with adding a new vendor. There's contracting, there's KYC, there's a lot of effort that goes into bringing on a new vendor. So I think right out of the gate, you can quantify that by showing a reduction in cost of adding the vendor cost from the procurement. And then I would say that key to Tradeshift strategy is some of our BPO partnerships that will manage the contract negotiation and the seller compliance and the catalog management that typically takes a great deal of effort from the buyers and sellers. So we're giving tools to our what we call our marketplace operator to administer the marketplace that makes it more efficient and takes a lot of the burden both off of the buyer and from the seller. And we're releasing 2 new features that speak more to the control aspect that I mentioned earlier. So one of the things we're building is a purchase request policy validation API. It's kind of a mouthful, but the idea behind it is that when a purchase request is submitted, we can validate the items in that purchase request, in the marketplace purchase request, against a third-party policy validation tool that you might have. So companies, whether it's the BPO partner or the companies themselves that have the policy rules, you can validate that anything that goes into the marketplace is supposed to be there, right? So anything that the customer orders is compliant with their overall policies. So that's a big one. And the second feature that we're building is a KYC API, which will allow our BPO partners or marketplace operators to extract data about the sellers who've enrolled in the marketplace and verify either manually or against third-party data sources that the sellers are who they say they are, and they meet the compliance requirements that the buyers will have. So again, maintaining this control and the standard procurement policies that they already have in place. And for the sellers, I think we'll probably talk a lot more about this in a few moments, but for the sellers, there's 2 obvious areas of benefit for them. And one is increase in demand for their products and services. And the second is the cost of entry. So reducing the amount of effort it takes to actually do business with a particular buyer. You're onboarding once to the marketplace, and then you're having access to a large assortment of buyer demand.
That's incredibly thorough. And I think we covered, a lot on the buyer side there and a bit on the supplier side. But Subrata, are there any other benefits for suppliers that you see in addition to what John pointed out?
So it's mainly on the demand side that I would add, our network and the platform really opens them up to various buyers, right? So now they are not, it's like a one to many and many to one and many to many relationship. They have access to all of our buyers and doing business. So I think that's the main. And then the onboarding, which I think John already touched upon, like as seamless and easy it becomes, they would be transacting more on the platform.
Super helpful. So, as we look ahead to whatever we want to call this future environment, and we admit a lot of this is here today in terms of many to many activities between buyers and suppliers via a network model. But as we look to the future, it's not just about transactions. We get into the whole area of ESG and sustainability. We get into broader aspects of governance. So kind of building on that, Subrata, especially in Europe, but increasingly in North America too, large corporates are coming under a lot of scrutiny around supply chain activities, around ethical practices. And it's not just sourcing, it's the continual practices within the supply chain. So how do you see marketplace models and Tradeshift evolving to address that?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And I would add to that it's just not, the government and the regulations coming after the companies. It's also an increased awareness with the end consumer, the customer. That is also a driving factor of why more companies and they want to manufacture or procure goods in a more ethical manner. And the way we think about this is enriching and enhancing our seller profiles to make it very transparent and visible to the buying organizations into the practices that the suppliers follow. So, and our approach has been that enriching this data with some third party and external where we do not have, so that it becomes very transparent of the seller's practices.
That makes sense. So John, if we kind of flip that to the supply side, how can suppliers, showcase their capabilities here? How can, suppliers not just reach the global market, but kind of show what they are doing, their certifications, their practices, and what is the role of a marketplace in doing that for suppliers?
Yeah, great question. And for Tradeshift, I think it comes back to one of the foundational technical elements of our solution, and that's that we're a network, which means that many buyers can connect to many sellers and vice versa. And a seller could actually be a buyer. There's both AR and AP and procurement in all these organizations, right? So Tradeshift gives sellers the ability to access demand. And it doesn't have to be the first step that they make in the Tradeshift platform. They could start with something simple. They're doing business with their buyer invited them to the platform, but we give them the ability to manage product data, to upload inventory and pricing, and that allows them to showcase that product assortment to buyers who are already on the network. So they can offer that in a direct buying relationship with an end customer, but they can also use that in a marketplace context. So they can join a marketplace and offer the product catalogs that they already have. They can manage pricing, and that pricing can be specific to that marketplace, but they can gain access to that marketplace by virtue of being on the platform. So we're really trying to lower the barrier of entry for companies who may start with something quite simple, which is, hey, I need to submit an invoice to get paid with a buyer I already have a contract with. But we're then exposing them to a great deal more opportunities with other buyers, global buyers on the network, and making it easier to do business with them because we're walking them through the KYC and the vetting process, so they don't have to discover that on their own at high cost.
So we've covered quite a bit of ground, and a lot of this may seem radical to organizations, and there might even be cases where there are parts of organizations doing this today, but others in the same corporate or supplier don't even know that it's happening. So in general, I'm curious about your views on buyer and supplier readiness for these changes. And is the market there today? Is this something we can jump into? And I'll toss it to both of you to kind of close there.
Yeah, maybe Subrat, I can go first, and then
Sure.
you can follow up.
Yep.
So I think it does depend on the seller, and it also depends on the effort that is required to get access to these marketplace opportunities or digitization opportunities. And that's why I'll come back to my earlier point, which buying organizations need to make it easy. They need to stop thinking about it as checks and hoops that the seller needs to jump through. It's more about delivering value, incremental value to the seller so they can adopt this and become more comfortable. Been in the industry for a number of years and seen a lot of very complex technical integrations that are required for a seller to get up and running. And frankly, that's a barrier to entry that a lot of companies are not willing to overcome for an unknown payoff in the end. So there are going to be companies that are very eager to access the demand and access this digital link because they recognize the opportunity it gives them, and they have high technical capability. And those are the early adopters. And then there's the middle of the road companies where they have maybe limited technical ability, and they have interest in establishing this digital link, but they don't know exactly how to leverage it. And I think that's really the opportunity. That's where we are today, where companies that haven't dipped their toe in the waters, if we're making it an intuitive experience for them, if we can demonstrate value to them in the initial steps of the digitization process, then they're going to invest more. They're going to see a return on that investment where they can be fully embedded in that digital link with their buyers, and then take advantage of more advanced functionality like marketplaces.
Okay. And I would just add an overall theme here that the word digitization, I think, means different things to different companies. It might sound like, swapping old systems with newer platforms and technology, or a integration of solutions that enables more collaboration and communication across parties, or is it more rethinking about supply chain processes from planning to production to the end customer? And the idea is that digitization is all of this, but however, we see that different companies have a different understanding, or at are at different levels. So the companies that kind of understand this whole process and the journey, they would benefit the most out of the digitization.
That's great. Well, John and Subrata, really great discussion. Really enjoyed the back and forth. We're certainly, facing a situation in terms of global supply chains today, which is unique. And we absolutely need new approaches to collaboration between buyers and suppliers across the board. So really enjoyed the dialogue and look forward to more of it in the future.
Yes, likewise.
Jason, thank you so much for your
Thank
time.
you so much.
Thanks, everyone. That was certainly a very stimulating conversation. Now, clearly, we have a lot to think about. First, with regards to connectivity and the underlying tissue that links these complex systems. And second, I want to make sure we recognize we need to explore and embrace the deeper value of digitalization and how it can empower the mitigation of the chaos we all experienced due to this pandemic. Now, just a quick reminder that our next session will feature our CEO, Christian Lang, in conversation with Rob Van Eipenberg, Managing Director of Quintess. They will be discussing the emergence of the global economy from the COVID pandemic and sharing some of their expert views and experiences. They'll also be getting into the weeds of supply chain resilience, talking about whether or not we can look forward to any sort of respite from the kinds of disruption supply chains continue to experience, or if enterprises should simply consider it the new normal. Fascinating stuff. All right, lots to think about, and I hope you'll join us for our next session. Bye for now.